thank you for being here for just a few minutes to help sort these things out. The former federal prosecutor now working as a defense lawyer. How about it for David Katz, everybody?
Great to be with you, Mark.
David, what is the impression you have after the jury came down with all of these convictions? I mean, there was no exception. Would you have expected, not guilty on some things, guilty on others, or is this run of the table something that we can take something on?
I think the run of the table was logical because all of the falsification of business records were interconnected. Trump signed those checks, 12 of them. Each one of them was a count in 2017 to break up the payments to Michael Cohen, the $420,000 into 12 divisions, 12 counts. Then they put in the business records that this was a legal expense. They put that in about 12 times. And so I had an interesting story from yesterday because I was on KCBS, which is 97.1 here in the Southland, here in Los Angeles area. And I was on with Charles Feldman, who's a terrific reporter that they have. And he had me on just when they knew there was a verdict, but they didn't know what it was. So I said to him confidently that it was going to be guilty on these counts for felonies. And then he said to me, well, let me just puncture your confidence with a question. And then they went right to the courtroom because their reporter for CBS was reporting guilty count one, guilty count two. So he comes back to me right after that and says, well, and I said, I feel very unpunctured. I thought with the jury instructions being the way they were, I thought that was the only issue that might stand in the way and lead to a hung jury, that they would get into a situation where 4 of the jurors would say, I thought he committed state campaign finance violations, and 4 said, no, I think it was federal. That's the one that I thought was the most logical one that he would have been trying to do. And then another 4 would say, I'm not so sure about the campaign thing, whether he was focused on that, but he sure knew that by putting down $420,000 as ordinary and necessary legal expenses that he hadn't actually spent because he was reimbursing the hush money, that was a tax fraud in the making or an attempted tax fraud. 4 of them would say one thing, 4 of them would say the other. They would get off on this thing. I think it was his taxes. No, I think it was the campaign finance thing. And they would have a lack of unanimity. But with them only having to find that there was some unlawful purpose in the cover-up, that the boosted up charge, the bumped up charge to a felony was just a cover-up with an unlawful purpose, I thought it was very plain and simple that they had proven that beyond a reasonable doubt to the satisfaction of all 12. So I guess my overall thinking about the case is very significant, very historic to have a former president of the United States and to have Trump, who's going to get the Republican nomination, to have this person convicted of multiple felony counts. No doubt significant, no doubt historic. But in terms of its actual impact on the race, I don't think it's really going to have that much. I think it's kind of baked in by the Republicans, by the Democrats, either way. And it may affect some swing voters, but I think that really remains to be seen from a political point of view. From a legal point of view, he's allowed to run, Mark. He's allowed to serve. He's going to be nominated. I don't think he's going to get any prison time. I mean,
that was what I was going to. Chad in Reno writes today, will he do any jail time, David? And you're saying no, he won't.
I don't think that the judge has discretion to give him up to 4 years. I just think that there are a lot of factors. Apparently, this is a Class E felony. It's a felony, no doubt about it. He's going to be a convicted felon unless he wins his appeal, and then it all gets thrown out and they start over again. If it's not a harmless error. And I think that at least on this issue of jury instructions, that would not be a harmless error. That would be an error that was one that would merit a new trial. But I just don't think that it's going to have, that much real impact because, it's a Class E felony. A is the worst. E is, lesser. Apparently 70% of people do get probation on that charge, even the ones convicted of the Class E felony. The fact that there are 34, as I say, once you do one, you do it all 34. So that, people say he's the president of the United States, former president of the United States, now charged with 34. Like, oh my God, that makes it 34 times as bad as if he'd been charged with one. That's not the reality of the situation. And with all of the imbroglios and, in my opinion, crimes and frauds that Trump has gotten involved in, this man has a clean record. Go figure. But the man is a first offender. So he's a first offender. 70% of the people get probation. On top of all of that, it is an older case. I just don't think he's going to get any prison time at all, including on the contempt for violating the gag order.
Well,
I think he
you've
will not get one
anticipated my
day.
next question. I mean, he's
I
got
think he
these
will not get one day in prison, and I don't think that he's going to get home detention, because that look of him being on home detention and being impeded in any way after July 11th, when the sentencing is going to be, that's when the home detention would kick in. It's too much in the campaign season. It looks too much like it would boomerang. The people who think I was on with Nikki Maduro after your show yesterday, and she was reveling in it. And I just said, look, you may be reveling in it, but you know what? If your goal is to make sure that Trump does not get back into office again, prison sentence, even a home detention sentence, is counterproductive, I believe, to those goals. I'm not a political scientist, but that's my take on it from just, being so much a part of this legal commentary of it.
Yeah, I don't see it as a political winner. As you suggested, it's already baked in. A lot of the reaction and poll numbers would seem to reflect that it's baked in. And here's the other thing. The fundraising that was done after the verdict, it was so feverish that the Trump site crashed. And so they raised, I believe, $35 million overnight. That ain't nothing. So this idea is sort of a politically persecuted figure. To me, it's absurd, of course, and to you it may be absurd, but enough people buy it and also are jihadists when it comes to trying to take back power that they view this as a real warning shot across their bow type thing, and they're going to step up any way they can. So with the legal machinations continuing, and you suggesting that even on the contempt, there'll be no additional, there's be no amplification of this to the point that he would go to prison or even to house arrest. Let me just ask you, how then do you handle the contempt charges? I mean, you were talking about the fact that they are handled at the end during sentencing. What do? You just charge him a few more $1,000 and he's on his way?
I think he'll be charged a few more $1,000. I think that's sort of the reality. And he'll appeal all of this regarding the gag order. And I think that the gag order was a little bit not wise, to the extent that it stopped him Trump from commenting back on Michael Cohen and on Stormy Daniels, who were publicizing their criticism of him. It just seemed to me that, if they were criticizing him in the media, in fairness, he should have been allowed to criticize them back in the media. I think that he played that to his favor, that he was being gagged. And I think that, regarding the jurors, that was obviously out of line. But I think he did tamp it down regarding the jurors, and making comments like, it's an all Manhattan jury. They voted against me 85%. It was a terrible venue here. They want to write a book, whatever. I mean, that's not endangering them. It just seems to me that that's probably not a wise place for a punishment to go at this point. And again, what would the punishment be at this point? I mean, he could bring him in the day of his sentencing, and he could say, okay, I'm also sentencing you now for contempt of court on the gag order. So I'm going to have you step back into this holding room, and I'm going to make you be there for 3 hours with your Secret Service agents. What is the real rub that would be on Trump, as compared with that photo would go all over the world to his backers and everything else? So I think, sometimes the better part of discretion is not to overreact. And I think that the judge has to be very careful not to overreact. I said from the beginning of the case that I thought this judge got played by Trump by saying, under New York law, you have to be in my courtroom. You have to be in my courtroom every day. It would have been so much wiser to say, you know what? I know that that's the rule in general. This is an extraordinary case. I'm making a waiver in this case. You can come any day you want to, not come any day you don't want to. There are more important things that you need to do, like campaign. You go and do them. And you know what? Trump would have lost this great talking point that he had, and he would have been in court almost every single day, because he wanted to monitor those witnesses and confront them, right?
Yeah, but you know what, David? I'm sorry, but I take issue with you with, and on the legal stuff. I yield to you. I mean, on everything, but on this one thing where you sort of suggest that he can make rhetorical hay or political hay of it. I don't know about that. No matter what happened with this case, you knew that Trump was going to claim, "I can't believe this. This judge is in the tank for Biden, et cetera." And there's this thing that we do where we kind of want to give him a break so there won't be a talking point or whatever. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how big a break is given. The talking points are there, and they will manipulate whatever event that they must to get that talking point. So I don't know that it would have made a difference in that regard.
Mark, let me ask you this question. We pick up the newspaper a month from now, and we see that a state court, state prosecutor near the border in Texas has charged Biden with an offense down there in Texas because he and Ali Mayorkas, the head of DHS, have supposedly conspired under state law to allow aliens to come into the United States. Okay. And there's going to be a trial. And the judge intones that, under Texas law, you have to be in my courtroom every single day. And so Biden and Mayorkas are now, and especially Biden, is pinned down there for 6 weeks. Let's assume that he makes a presidential argument. He makes this argument that
he's a sitting president. Exactly.
You can't do that to me under federalism, and that is rejected by the Texas state courts, and the U.S. Supreme Court keeps its hands off it. People would howl, Mark, if that judge in Texas said, "Biden, you have to be in my courtroom 6 weeks." It would have been so much wiser if that were to happen. If the judge said, "You know what? President Biden, you go where you need to go. You campaign where you need to go. You can not be in my courtroom, no matter what Texas law says." That would be just so much smarter. So on this particular issue, I know that Trump will make hay of everything, but I think they played into his hands on this one. I think the judge was being a little bit too, "I'm the judge, I'm imperial, these are the rules, I'm going to treat you like everyone else." You can't treat him like everyone else. You have to use discretion. On that point, the idea of no one's above the law, President Biden, you need to sit in that courtroom for 6 weeks in the heart of the campaign season. No, people like you and me, I think, would have said that that was totally unfair. And what's good for the goose is good for the gander. That's the rule of law.
The idea somehow that a regular citizen with 34 counts on the guilty side would do jail time. True or false? Is that a reasonable notion or not?
70% of normal people convicted of this offense do not do jail time. They get probation, 70%. You have to figure the 30%, some of them are people with prior criminal records, and some of them, it involves a lot more money. Remember, he's got the $500 million civil case that involved a huge amount of money. This one involves $130,000 in hush money when it got grossed up so that Cohen wouldn't get hit with a big tax bill that would make it undesirable for Cohen to have done this for Trump. It went to 420. 420,000 or 130,000 is, in the scheme of things, not that much money. So you'd have to say if this were an ordinary person, it seems to me they would be in the 30%. They don't have a prior criminal record. It's a fairly small amount of money given falsifying business records for, you can imagine you could falsify millions of dollars worth of business records. I think that this is a case that calls for probation. And then the issue is what would be the conditions of probation? And to the extent the conditions of probation were anything that were onerous to Trump in running, you're going to have the argument that it's election interference. And if it were imposed, ask yourself, whatever condition is imposed on Trump, how about if Biden got convicted?
The same thing, right. Right.
Would that be fair to Biden? If it's not fair to Biden, it wouldn't be fair to. That's who's clashing. That's it. It's going to be one of those two, and that's all it's about. It's not about RFK Jr. It's not about anything else. That those two running against each other, and what's fair for one is fair for the other. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say Biden hasn't been convicted of anything. Trump has been, but that's not the way that it's perceived. And I think that, discretion is the better part of judicial valor in this case for the sentencing judge.
So. The reality is, it's just what you've described. It'll be a probation. They're asking in the chat repeatedly. So if that's all there is, it's probation for 3 years or something like that. And you're saying, yeah, and that's reasonably fair.
This was a case that the federal prosecutors under the Biden administration declined. They did not go on it. The DA went on it, I think, did a masterful job in the prosecution. I was on last night a show called The Other Side of Midnight. It's on WABC radio for insomniacs in New York.
Sure.
And I was on with a really hardcore Trump supporter. I mean,
Well,
this guy.
WABC is like, they are right wingers too.
This guy could have written Trump's speeches. It was the same thing. This is unprecedented. This is awful. This is the end of democracy. This is the end of the rule of law. Everybody should be impeached. All the prosecutors should go to jail on this case and stuff like that. Trump doesn't really have very many arguments. This case tried very, very well. Michael Cohen went in, was a very persuasive witness. He was much more persuasive because he kept his cool in the case where the $500 million was returned. The judge said that this is, an impartial judge said that he was a very persuasive witness. I thought he was very persuasive in this case, Mark. I always say the New York Post could say liar, perjurer, thief, ranter and raver, manipulator. And guess what? Very believable on the facts that Trump knew and intended to commit this crime. And they kept saying, this whole issue of the jury instructions, that was all they pounded away at, the jury instructions. And what's interesting is that we former federal prosecutors, I think, take this argument more seriously than the former DAs. The former DAs in New York said, this is par for the course. There's a cover up. That's what bumped it up. There was a felony cover up with unlawful intent. That's all you need. All these guys saying they should have been a special verdict and they should have had to pick criminal tax, criminal campaign finance violation. They think that we're all wet, that we're overanalyzing it, and they think it's a pretty easy case on appeal for the prosecution. And I think the other issues are really insubstantial. So I think at the end of the day, and it'll be years from now, there'll be a final judgment on appeal that Trump is guilty of all 34 counts. I'm just saying that I think it would be a huge mistake, and it would be a little contrary to the law and what happens to ordinary people found guilty of this Class E felony who don't have a criminal record, to give him any jail time or even home detention time. I know people want to see, especially Michael Cohen with the T-shirt, and he's gotten away with so many things, Trump. He's been so not held accountable. I mean, January 6th, we're going to have in just a couple of weeks a decision on January 6th. I'm hoping that while there may not be time for a trial, there'll be time for an evidentiary hearing, Mark, which will really bring back home to people the awful things. I mean, whatever Trump did in this case, to me, they aren't awful things. January 6th and Mar-a-Lago are absolutely awful things. The latter, it really did, was counter to the national security of this country, dangerous to this country, and the total selfishness of Trump.
You're talking about the document, taking the documents, jacking them to Mar-a-Lago. That's what you're talking
about. Taking
the
documents, keeping the documents. We've talked about this till the cows come home, that I don't think Jack Smith, who's done a very good job, should have taken a 1 in 3 chance of that case going in front of Judge Cannon. Now she's talking about his improprieties, not her own improprieties. And you can guess that that's going to happen because she's got a huge amount of power with her black robe. Unless she's taken off that case, she can make Jack Smith's life miserable. That's the reality of, we have these kings and queens on the federal bench. They're like gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus. They really are. They're the closest thing we have to gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus.
Yeah, these judges and justices, I will say this, it's rich to see and hear the GOP come out in lockstep claiming that the justice system is not fair, it's fixed, it's targeted against Donald Trump. I'm thinking, are you kidding me? You have the Supreme Court, which is completely stolen, and totally in the tank for Trump, to the point that Alito is flying a flag above his homes, suggesting how much in the tank he is and his wife is for the GOP and for the causes associated with Donald Trump. You have Eileen Cannon, as you just suggested, who has parked the case that would cut right through all the noise and clearly show Trump to be who he is, having corrupted the entire system of national security, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there are many, many more examples of the way that the system is bent over backwards to accommodate Trump. So yes, the fix is in for Trump. Still, despite all of that, we get a guilty a conviction and verdict in this Trump case in New York.
It's great that he was held accountable. And I said to people last night, because everyone was talking about this, I said, if you're unhappy about the fact that he's not going to go to prison on this case, think if it had gone the other way. Think if he were right now trumpeting his acquittal by that jury. That did not happen. As I said, I thought they presented a very good case. When I was debating this fellow last night for an hour on the other side of midnight, I was 11 o'clock my time. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. You wonder. So we had all the insomniacs in New York, and they were all calling it. It was really a fascinating show. And I pointed out that, Trump In the court of public opinion, he didn't take the stand. Think how devastating that is. Under the Fifth Amendment, in court, you can't comment on the fact that the defendant didn't take the stand and defend, himself or herself. But in the old days, before the Fifth Amendment was interpreted that way, every prosecutor would say 30 steps. 30 steps, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. 30 steps is all the defendant needed to take from where he sits right there and claims he's not guilty to getting on the stand and telling you what actually happened. That's a totally fair argument in the court of public opinion. Trump said he wanted to talk to Mueller, then he never did give any kind of statement to Mueller under oath. He never would let himself be deposed or questioned under oath orally by Mueller. Then he said he absolutely wanted to testify in this case. He never took the stand in this case. He could have gotten up there in the court of public opinion and said, Michael Cohen is lying. He never explained this thing to me. He could have said, I was worried about my wife. I didn't want my wife to find out this was going to happen. That was going to happen. I didn't want my kids to know. I went to a lot of efforts to not tell my kids. That time when he called on the phone, the 96 seconds, I remember that one. All that he talked about was with my body man about that 14-year-old who was stalking him. He could have gone back and explained the records. Trump didn't do any of that. And the one witness that he called blew up in his face. They had great cross-examination on that guy. Trump's lawyers, after they got millions of dollars to defend him, called that guy anyway. And they knew what the cross-examination was going to be. They were so arrogant that I guess they thought, well, these professional prosecutors are a bunch of dummies who are going to miss it. They had all the cross-examination on that guy Costello, and they ate him alive. And then there was no more defense. So Trump going out on the courthouse steps is not a defense. Mm-hmm. So the case tried very well. And I pointed this all out on the radio last night, debating the Trumpster. And he said, maybe his lawyers were ineffective. His lawyers were not ineffective. Trump's lawyers had very little to work with.
Let me just ask you, as a defense attorney, you mentioned the Trump testimony that we didn't see. He didn't take the stand. Would you have counseled him? Explain to me why it would have been a bad thing for Donald Trump to take the stand as a defense attorney.
It would have been a bad thing. First, the judge had said what he would allow the cross-examination to be about. He kept out many of the, of the frauds that Trump had done, but some of them were quite relevant. So Trump would have been asked about instances where Trump had lied. And so it would have been like, okay, they pointed out that Cohen lied. They would have pointed out that Trump lied. He lied about this. He lied about that. He committed fraud. Some of the stuff would have been too prejudicial to even cross-examine him about, like, let's say, the E. Jean Carroll stuff. So the judge made very clear, and that's going to be one of his issues on appeal. That was one of Harvey Weinstein's issues on appeal. Weinstein won. The judge tells you ahead of time under New York law, if you take the stand, Mr. Defendant, I'm going to allow you to be asked about these 5 areas. I'm not going to allow you to be asked about those other 5 areas. In the Weinstein case, too many would have been allowed in. And so what a defendant like Weinstein or Trump does is they say, well, given you're going to allow those 5 things to be asked about me, and you're wrong, Judge, on the law, I'm not going to take the stand. I'm going to appeal that and say that I would have taken the stand and I should get a new trial because you would have asked me too many things. The judge made that error 4-3, the highest court in New York said. The judge made that error in the Weinstein case. That was one of the 2 reasons that Weinstein is getting a new trial. Trump's going to try to play that same card, but I think this judge, knowing the Weinstein decision had been decided the way it was decided, he didn't make the same mistake. He circumscribed more what Trump would have been cross-examined about. But even so, the cross-examination of Trump would have been brutal, and he showed himself to be a terrible witness. The few times he has been under oath, you remember the deposition where he says, that E. Jean Carroll, she wasn't my type, she didn't appeal to me. So they showed him a photograph when he was under oath, the deposition of her, and said, who's that? Is that my daughter Ivanka? Well, we know that he thinks she's like the most beautiful girl in the world. So he confuses the photo of the woman who's of no appeal to him at all for his beautiful daughter. And he did that all under oath. And he said a bunch of other really stupid, self-incriminating things under oath. So there was no way that any competent attorney was going to call him to the stand. But in the court of public opinion, when he says these were all lies and I was railroaded, the fact that he could have taken the stand and explained his side of the story, and he didn't, I think that's important. And he could have tried to call that CFO of his, Mark. The fact that the guy had been convicted of perjury, if that CFO could have really helped him, if he'd have said, look, all those figures that I wrote down on there, those figures that I wrote down, Trump had nothing to do with it. I kept Trump in the dark. Here's what I actually did. Here's the different things that I did to keep him in the dark. So I generated that famous list of how we were going to split up the $420,000. But Trump was completely ignorant of it. Let me explain how. He had the power of subpoena. He could have called that guy to the stand. And the reason he didn't call, Weisselberg's already gone to jail twice for him. The whole thing, Mark, is so unbelievable. They have a $2 million deal that this Weisselberg is going to keep getting the $2 million. And I got to tell you, I'd be a pretty tough judge on some things. I'd be pretty, I think, middle of the road on most things, but I'd be pretty tough on some things. And when I realized that the guy was going to get $2 million from Trump, right? And then I had a chance to sentence him, I wouldn't have given him 5 months. I'd have made him wait a lot more than 5 months before he got his hands on that corrupt $2 million if I were the judge. So Weisselberg, the CFO, knows he gets out of jail. He's going to start getting the $2 million. And you also wonder if Trump has something else on some other people near and dear to Weisselberg. And so Weisselberg figures, I'll be the hero of this story. I'll take the fall, and other people near and dear to me will go on with their lives because Trump knows too much.
Well, the Weisselberg part of the Trump organization is wild because we know a lot based on the fact that there was a divorce proceeding going on, and the ex of one of, was it his son or, yeah, there was some ex, the ex-wife, as these divorce proceedings were going, she just sang like a canary, as I recall. I mean, that was, this is how we know a lot of those details. But Weisselberg did take the fall for him. It's interesting that Weisselberg would have been someone to call for Trump. Go ahead.
He took 2 falls and went to Rikers Island prison 2 times, and he's there as we speak, serving that 5-month sentence. But when he gets out, he's supposed to get this big chunk of change.
Is there some concierge level at Rikers that we don't know about? Or he's there with maybe there's like breakfast, croissant, coffee in the morning? Because most of what I've seen in Rikers is pretty unforgiving.
If you're in the health unit, if you're in the infirmary or something like that, apparently you get better treatment because after all, you're in the medical unit. And that's where Harvey Weinstein was. And there was a lot of controversy in the New York tabloids that he was getting concierge service over there. God only knows. None of it's. If you've ever been to one of those prisons, those serious, not the federal ones, which are kind of a different bag, but those state ones, you just think to yourself, oh my God, I'm going to obey the letter of the law always, all the time, as to everything. The best way, I'll tell you, as a criminal defense lawyer and a former prosecutor, the best way you never have to deal with any of this stuff, do the right thing, do the legal thing, sleep like a baby.
Go ahead, Kim.
House Republicans are pretty upset. And the House Judiciary Chairman, Jim Jordan, today, we know, says he plans to request testimony from the DA Alvin Bragg, and also from Prosecutor Matthew Colangelo. He said the hearing will focus on what he called the unprecedented political prosecution of President Trump. So it's not clear yet if Alvin Bragg will agree to appear before this panel. But my question based on that is there going to be backlash against all the people that were involved in this trial? I don't know if they necessarily had a choice. The prosecutor might not have had a choice. It's told by the DA, you got to prosecute the case. And so I don't know. Is there going to be some type of repercussion or consequence for people that were involved in the prosecution of Trump?
Well, I don't think any of the prosecutors were conscripted into this case. I mean, this is the case of a lifetime. I think most of the prosecutors were very eager to work on it. Any kind of political or personal retaliation should be ruled out. But I mean, I think that's what's going to happen here. That's exactly what's going to happen here. As to Colangelo, they made a big deal about him. And just to talk about him for 30 seconds. So Colangelo is a very, very smart guy who, when Biden comes into office, he makes him an acting high official in the Department of Justice federally. But he doesn't end up getting the job, I think the number 3 job at Justice. Somebody else gets it. Colangelo works there because, again, he's a very smart guy. And then he thinks, what am I going to do with my career now? And then this case is going on in the DA's office in New York. And he says, you know what, I'm going to apply for that job. And he gets that job. But that is the only shred of connection. That's the only tiny little hook that Trump has to say, you see, it's all a Biden thing. They're all trying to get me. This guy had a right to go on with his career, get one great job at the Department of Justice, and then get his next great job, which was being on the panel or being on the group that prosecuted Trump. I mean, it's, as Trump would say, it's really a nothing burger, but they tried to hang their hat on that. As to Bragg, I mean, they can do stuff like that. And I mean, Bragg will have whatever privileges he may have. not to testify, but I think to some extent he'll have to testify, and there'll be some publicly available information that I think that he'll have to provide. And I think Bragg has nothing to hide. Bragg evaluated the case. You remember that? First, he didn't go on the case. He had a couple of people that his predecessor had hired. One of them wrote a book. But I think Bragg, he hired good people. He had good people try the case. The people who tried the case, like Colangelo, they have nothing to hide either. There are certain things that may be privileged in the case, and Congress can't get those things that are privileged. Something was properly placed under seal by the judge. I think there's going to be an effort to try to unseal it. They'll try to say, oh, it's under seal. This is the Democratic judge. But it's interesting. Last night, they were blasting the judge in that case, Merchan. And what was interesting was that Merchan was actually picked by Bloomberg. He was apparently a Bloomberg favorite, and Mayor Bloomberg, who's no flaming liberal, for God's sake, when they had the Republican convention in New York City that renominated W, he rounded up thousands and thousands of people, stuck them on some pier to stop them from demonstrating. Bloomberg and his administration had to pay millions of dollars for their civil rights violations against demonstrators against W. That's the guy who liked Judge Merchan. I mean, give it a rest,
Well, I'm also, it is true. This is, Maud points this out. It's rich that Jim Jordan, who is the fire-breathing dragon of the right on Capitol Hill, didn't honor his own subpoena, and yet he's subpoenaing the, Alvin Bragg. It's comical almost,
Great point, Maud. Do as I say, not as I do. Jordan's motto.
Look, you're so great to respond to this last-minute request for your take and analysis. It's been great. You've been so accurate. I'll remind everyone that, David started this kind of saying, I don't know if there is a case here. It was turned down, at the federal level, et cetera. And yet, and by the prior DA. But then you began to look at the specifics in a different way, see the various pieces of the case that were brought, and you said, I actually think that they're going to prevail here, that they're going to get a guilty verdict. And you were right.
I thought starting with Pecker and the National Enquirer, the catch and kill thing, put it all in brilliant context, involved Trump right from the beginning in the conspiracy, showed that it also involved McDougal as well as Stormy Daniels. And I think Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen were both much better witnesses than you would have predicted ahead of time, much more persuasive, much more poised on the stand. And, those things matter. And then the defense was very weak. I thought the body man was going to hit the stand. I thought that they would somehow get Weisselberg up there and he'd have an epiphany that Trump wasn't involved. But if you're a cynic, you think, you know what, he'd already gone to jail twice for Trump. And he didn't want to go to jail a third time by committing what would have been probably deemed perjury. And so Weisselberg stayed clear of it. And so it ended up trying very well for the prosecution. And it didn't try well at all, despite the millions of dollars he spent on his lawyers. It didn't try well for Trump. And
those lawyers seem to be, forwarding certain arguments in court that were designed to kind of land well with Trump, was my take on it, not so much legally, based on what you were saying. Get the question from yesterday, Mark. Yeah, the question for David. We're running out of time, or we've run out of time, but I'll still ask. Many people are asking David Katz, why did you go from being a federal prosecutor to a defense lawyer? Can you speak to that quickly?
There are a lot of cliques in the government, and the two federal prosecutors I was very close to, one was Steve Trott, who hired me. He's still on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The other one was Robert Bonner, who was just a wonderful person, a wonderful prosecutor. He became a federal judge. So I thought I would go into private practice. A really good firm offered me a position. And I thought I would try the criminal defense side. And it ended up being, I thought, really fascinating. I've enjoyed it ever since. And, once you become a criminal defense attorney, unless you get a super high job, you don't tend to go back to being a prosecutor. Someone like Ali Mayorkas, who went from being in the same U.S. attorney's office as I was, and then he went into private practice, and then he got the deputy DHS, job. So no one's offered me.
I love that David Katz calls Alejandro Mayorkas Ali Mayorkas. That's how you guys really were pals, I guess.
And so no one's offered me DHS deputy or DHS head, but I would probably go back to the government if they did.
Why isn't Katz still a roadie? Asks Phineas. Yeah, there you go. Roadie for you missed it for the Barkays and for Isaac Hayes.
That was a fantastic job, but I decided to, what's the line in Maggie May? I decided I could have gone on, go back to school, right? Remember?
Yeah, that's right. I'm going back to school.
He could have been find a rock and roll band that needed a helping hand. So I worked for the rock and roll band that needed a helping hand, the funk band that needed a helping hand, but then I decided to go back to school.
Love our time with you. When we visit on Thursday, sir, I want to ask you about the Menendez case because it's very interesting. I've been doing a lot of reading about the Menendez case, and he's trying to throw his wife under the bus, and it may not work out so well for him. So let's get to that on Thursday. David, thank you for all of your and this isn't over. We have sentencing on July 11th, right? So this continues. David Katz, everybody. Thanks, David. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.